Welcome, thank you for coming. There are still some people. I hope you can find a place to sit down too. We're going to talk about growing up, being children, childish. Are we living in infantile times or an infantile age, as today's speaker suggests? So, in 2014, Susan Neiman, philosopher, director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam, wrote this book, Why Grow Up? Subversive Thoughts for an Infantile Age. And maybe today, this year even, more than ever, it is of importance to think about being mature, being a grown-up. I don't know if you've seen the speech made by 16-year-old Greta Thunberg, the Swedish climate activist, who in a speech for all the world leaders in Katowice said, "You are not mature enough to tell it like it is. Even that burden you leave to us, children." So maybe she is being very mature in addressing it. So that's what we will be talking about. We will speaking of the young, of children acting mature, of grown-ups acting like children, of what it means to be a grown-up really, and how to grow up, be a grown-up in this infantile age. So first, Susan Neiman will give a lecture of about 45 minutes. Afterwards, I will delve into matters with her further. By the way, my name is Lisa Doeland. I work as a programmer at Radboud Reflects. And then afterwards, the floor is to you as well for questions and comments. But now, first of all, a warm welcome to Susan Neiman.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for the invitation. You don't need to be Peter Pan to feel uneasy about the prospect of becoming an adult. Now, I'm not talking about cows, so I have to make sure that I've figured out how to work this. No. Here we go. Okay. Peter Pan. It's easy to argue that Peter Pan, most drastically imitated by Michael Jackson, is a symbol of our times. Being grown up is widely considered to be a matter of renouncing your hopes and dreams, accepting the limits of the reality you're given, and resigning yourself to a life that will be less adventurous, worthwhile, and significant than you thought when you began it. Simone de Beauvoir ended the third volume of her autobiography with the reflection that there wasn't much of the world she hadn't seen. And I'm going to quote, it's a famous passage, "The opera of Beijing, the arena of the Huelva, the dunes of El Aude, the dawns in Provence, Castro talking to 500,000 Cubans, the white nights of Leningrad, an orange moon over the Piraeus." Not only did she travel the world at a time when, unlike ours, travel like that couldn't be taken for granted, the loves and the friendships, the meaningful work and the acclaim for it were nearly as numerous and varied as the places she saw. It's very hard to imagine a life more full or less wasted. Yet she concludes the list of her travels with a look back at the girl she once was, quote, "gazing at the gold mine at my feet, a whole life to live," and concludes that she was cheated. Now, there are writers who argue that few people these days want to grow up, but if being adult is a matter of feeling in one's more honest moments that one's been cheated, who can blame them? Can philosophy help us find a model of maturity that's not a matter of resignation? For the record, my Oxford thesaurus lists philosophical as a synonym for resigned. Nonetheless, I believe that it can. One of the strangest things about writing a book about growing up was the reactions of my friends. Several expressed dismay and even disgust when they heard I was writing about this. "My hero was always Peter Pan," said one. That dismay is telling, for the people who expressed it are among the most successful grown-ups I know. I was shocked by the way this particular person said his hero was Peter Pan. I can't think of anybody less Peter Pan-like than he is. I'm not talking about conventional success, though some of them have that in spades, but something else that for me is successful as a grown-up, the ability to stay radiantly, glowingly alive to the world and its possibilities, to be equally open to learning from an ancient text or a market woman on a street corner, to acknowledge the depths of the very concrete evils that permeate the world and still be determined to face them down where they can, to call out monstrosities where they occur and rejoice in every bit of beauty that comes their way, to know that the difference between poetry and kitsch is finer than often supposed, and to recognize it all the same. Such people, it's often said, are young at heart. We don't consider what we say or what we lose when we say things like that, or compliment a friend for looking younger than the age she's just named. Consider the fact, everybody takes it as a compliment, oh, he's young at heart. Oh, she doesn't look that old. Consider the fact that no one under the age of, say, 25 wants to hear it. Tell a 7 or a 14 or a 20-year-old that they look younger, and you're likely to be met with an insulted pout. They want nothing more than to be perceived as older, that is, mature, competent, self-determined, powerful. Those of us over 30, by contrast, will feel a tinge of something between pride and relief. We don't stop to think how our acceptance of an equation between looking young and looking good, or being young at heart and being open to the world, spells our own doom. But it does, for it suggests that we can only be perceived as appealing when we appear to be what we're not. Many of the more honest among us try to avoid that duplicity by taking the bull by the horns and joking round about the age of 50 about being over the hill, by talking, for example, about having a senior moment when you forget something that anyone in their 30s might just confidently dismiss as unmemorable. I always found such jokes painful and slightly buffoonish, but it's only recently that I began to think about what such apparently harmless banalities do to the young. When they see us longing for an age they long to get over, what futures can they have in view? Each one of them knows that our well-meant advice to savor the best years of their lives is a problem, for those years are really hard. With little experience and even less self-assurance, they make their first decisions with the conviction that every decision is fateful. This love story, this course of study, this job will forever determine the course of their lives. Add to that the pressure that they are failing at savoring, for their lives, they're constantly told, will only get worse, and you have a recipe for the misery that marks the third decade of life. They know how uncertain and torn and confused they are. Where the culture continually tells them that this is the best it will ever get, what hopes can they have? Given how few people who've retained a clear memory of their 20s would actually choose to repeat them, and given that a variety of cross-cultural studies show that people generally get happier as they get older, the point of this false message, these are the best years of your life, can only be political in the very broadest sense. By describing the hardest decade of one's life as the best, we prepare young people to expect very little of the world and demand even less. Our adoration of youth hurts all of us, for it primes us to view life itself as a slow slide downhill. Now, a growing and extensive body of work in anthropology suggests that nostalgia for childhood is really confined to a small percentage of the world's population. those of us who were raised in cultures that can be called weird, as in Western, educated, industrial, rich democracies. Here I've learned a lot from the work of the anthropologist David Lancy, whose book, The Anthropology of Childhood, I recommend to anyone interested in the subject. Drawing on his own and other fieldwork around the globe, Lancy shows that most of what we assume about growing up is confined to cultures he calls neontocracies, those that place children at the top of a pyramid of value and status and adults at the bottom. Most of the world, by contrast, consists of gerontocracies in which the older you get, the more resources and attention you receive. They view children at best as desirable but pragmatically commodified chattel. Infants are not yet considered fully human, often considered swaddled or even hidden. They may be nursed longer than our children. In one tribe in Papua New Guinea, for instance, they're not weaned until about the age of 3, as they say, the age at which the child is able to recount her dreams. Yet the long nursing is a matter of the mother's convenience, not a precarious process of bonding. When babies in Cameroon gaze at their mothers during nursing, the mothers blow on the infant's eyes to make them avert their gaze. Nor does the intense, purposeful interaction between older children and adults that we think is necessary for cognitive development occur in village societies. Their children learn what they need to master their culture by carefully observing what older people do, be it catching fish, pounding grain, or performing rituals. And here I quote Lancy, "Nowhere in the entire ethnographic record of childhood have I found any instance of a parent and child building a block tower together or anything else whose purpose is to entertain while also instructing the child. In order to show that the top-down pedagogy model is biologically based, all parents in all cultures should be engaging in this kind of behavior with infants because in the theory, it establishes the foundation on which later teaching is built, but it doesn't." What does seem to be biologically based is the child's strong desire to be active, competent, and valued by the community. In traditional cultures, children do this by making themselves useful, first playing at pounding maize or planting yams, but very early gaining enough competence to perform truly valuable tasks, from minding younger children to herding camels, and they gain the recognition and identity which that value brings. Such competence is not gained through being treated gently, and we may be appalled at some of the examples the anthropologists bring from tribes in which toddlers are expected to learn how to handle knives by playing with them, or worse, those slow to learn to walk are placed on an anthill. Yes, injuries are taken more lightly, but the result is that most 10-year-olds in traditional cultures produce more food than they consume. Lancy, of course, is well aware of the abuse involved when millions of children are forced to labor outside their homes in mines or garbage dumps or brothels. But condemning that doesn't exclude us from questioning the ways in which our children are exempt from making contributions at all. And whether their labor is exploited or merely taken for granted by their families, one thing is certain: those who grow up in such cultures don't get wistful or nostalgic when talking about childhood. Until pretty recently, this was true of Europeans too. Descartes thought the reason for human unhappiness is the fact that we begin our lives as children. It's an extraordinary statement, given how we've gotten used to the idea, of course, that childhood is the happiest time. But that was Descartes' view. It's only 400 years ago. Aside from an occasional fond word for his mother, no classical author from Greece to China left a record of his childhood as golden or expressed a particular yearning for it. Since the rate of infant mortality imploded, we began having fewer children and pay more attention to the ones we have. Some would say too much attention. But lest all that spoiling make you nostalgic for those Spartan societies where children do some chores without complaining, let's recall what non-weird cultures are missing, namely most forms of choice. The parts on their stages allow for little variation, and the roles are largely fixed in advance. Members of village societies take the lives that are laid out for them. Even further, they vie for the lead in limited roles. A village dweller competes to become the best hunter in the forest, as the hedge fund manager competes to be the best in her firm. What they do not do, with very recent exceptions, is to ask the question, what should I do with all this freedom? That's a question that arose in the Enlightenment, for it was the Enlightenment that broke with the assumption that your freedom will be no greater than your father's. Only in the Enlightenment did the question of choosing a life path arise. Now, you may get most of your information from YouTube these days, but the problems of growing up are structural, and they're not a result of the internet dependence or the financial crisis. Though things like this may have made growing up harder in the last decade or so, the difficulties go much deeper. If weird cultures have been the exception, it's sad but safe to say that in another couple of decades, Apple and Facebook and Google and some corporation we have yet to imagine will ensure that the rest of the world follows the Western model. I want to look at the roots of that model. And to do this, I want to turn to my two favorite dead white men, Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Immanuel Kant. It's no accident that the problem of growing up was central for both of them. They came of age in a world that was just beginning to allow that your choices might be other and different than your father's were. Though it'd be hard to find two more different characters, they shared something very important. Both came from barely educated families of small craftsmen. Rousseau's father made watches, Kant's father made saddles, and it's quite certain that neither ever imagined the lives their sons would turn out to lead. I'm not going to talk about Rousseau tonight, except to say that those who find him mad or maddening should be pulled up by the role he played in Kant's life, which otherwise appeared to be so dull that Heinrich Heine wrote that Kant's life history was easy to describe since he had neither a life nor a history. Contrary to that view, which is quite popular, Kant wrote that Rousseau, who he called the Newton of the mind, something that every thinker in the 18th century wanted to be, Kant wrote Rousseau changed his life completely, and a portrait of Rousseau was the only picture in the Königsberg professor's home. Even more than Newton's, Rousseau's texts formed the background to Kant's work, though he said he found the Swiss author's sentences so beautiful that he had to read them several times over before he was calm enough to think about them. Knowing facts like these should change our picture of the dry old sage of Königsberg, as well as the wild star of Geneva, and allow us to read their work anew. Now, consider Kant's most famous essay, What is Enlightenment? I don't know if it's standardly read in Dutch high schools. I know it put generations of German high school students to sleep. Though it was written for the 18th century equivalent of the New York Review of Books, so it's not full of academic jargon in the way that some of his works are. The piece is confusing at first, glance a mixture of banality, contradiction, and an embarrassing amount of flattery. He says, our age is an age of enlightenment, but only Frederick has got there. Since he's not afraid of shadows, there's more freedom in his kingdom than in a republic. I've sometimes thought the essay should be read as an open letter to Frederick the Great, in which case the message, without all the flowery rhetoric, would go something like this. Your Majesty, you are old and weak, and fanatics are counting the days until they can take over your reigns. And in thinking circles, to put it mildly, your reputation is not the best. Lessing wrote that no land in Europe is as subjugated as yours. Even in Vienna or Paris, there's more freedom of political thought. Your scandalous treatment of Voltaire seems to confirm Rousseau's claim that intellectuals are only tolerated as long as they do nothing more than weave garlands of flowers around the chains that bind us. And nevertheless, out here in Königsberg, we know the difference between enlightened and absolute despotism. We need not look all that far to the east to see how much worse things could get. You haven't done much, but you've opened a door for improvement that plenty of people would like to close. For what do you want to be remembered in history? Playing the flute? I beseech you, show some courage, send us a sign. Yours truly, Immanuel Kant. Just in case you don't know that essay, that's my translation. That's not actually, you won't find it there. But, Kant was writing in a world of censors, and it's my view that that's what he was trying to say. Kant thought a lot about education and politics. If this was his real message, it was less in order to flatter the king than to portray an ideal of the ruler to which Frederick should aspire. For the times were threatening and reactionary forces were gathering. As Frederick's death grew nearer, Kant wrote another piece for the same publication, and its tone was almost hysterical, for he feared that Frederick's successors would undo his modest but genuine achievements, and indeed, temporarily, history did confirm his fears. But the text has multiple layers, and if those were Kant's reasons to write the text in 1784, they aren't the reasons to read it in 2019. Those reasons are the heart of the text, and they speak equally to those who would dare to be citizens and be truly enlightened rulers. If you only remember one line Kant ever wrote, it's likely to be the first sentence of What is Enlightenment, namely, enlightenment is humankind's exit from its self-inflicted immaturity, right? Enlightenment is the human being's exit from its self-imposed immaturity. The fact that the essay is far more readable than his scholarly text makes it all the more puzzling that so few people bother to read or anyway remember more than the first couple of sentences. There are good sentences. In them, Kant tells us that our immaturity is self-imposed because its cause is a lack of courage, not ignorance or stupidity, but laziness and cowardice keep us from thinking for ourselves. It's so easy to be immature. It's so comfortable to let others make decisions for me. He's right, of course, and even the most independently minded of us will acknowledge the occasional truth of what he says. Quote, I have no need to think, if only I can pay. Others will take over the tiresome business for me. And very often it is indeed our fault. We're unwilling to summon the energy or run the risks, even the risk of embarrassment, that thinking for ourselves would demand. And it's easy to see why this is the message that teachers emphasize when they teach the text in high schools. Surely we don't want the young to think there's anything wrong with society that a little hard work on their part can't fix. So the message of What is Enlightenment became the liberal mantra that only strengthened existing orders. If only any dissatisfaction you may feel with the world around you is all your fault. If only you could get rid of your own laziness and cowardice, you could be enlightened, grown up, and free. And it's no wonder that Germans of a certain age who had to memorize the essay in school roll their eyes and groan as soon as you mention selbstverschuldete Unmündigkeit. But Kant, as a matter of fact, is not preaching neoliberalism. He does not believe that your dissatisfaction is your fault alone. You may tend, as I do sometimes, to laziness and cowardice, but Kant says those tendencies are abused. There are guardians who've kindly taken over the task of supervising the rest of us by convincing us that independent thinking is not only difficult but dangerous. I quote again, after the guardians have first made the domestic animals dumb and prevented the placid creatures from daring to take a step on their own, the guardians emphasize the danger that threatens them if they try to go alone, which intimidates them and generally prevents them from ever trying, end quote. Now, this is couched in 18th century language. It's a radical and powerful political message. Our inability to grow up is not only our own fault. The social structures within which we live are constructed in order to keep us childish. The state has an interest in preventing us from thinking independently, and it cultivates and exploits our own worst tendencies in order to do so. The state's desire for control and our own desire for comfort combine to create societies with fewer conflicts, but they're not societies of grown-ups. So what guardians did Kant have in mind? He was living in feudal times when even enlightened rulers were paternalistic, and paternalistic was not yet a term of abuse. It's easy enough to see how feudal structures kept their subjects infantilized, but haven't Western democracies done away with that sort of thing? They don't have recourse to the paternalistic and authoritarian measures available in Kant's time. But given that those structures are lacking, how might a modern democratic society work to keep us infantilized? Oh, I missed one, okay. So, taking care of infants can be exhausting. I took care of 3 of them. I mean, that were my own, taking care of a few others along the way. But conceptually speaking, it's not that hard. A baby who's just learned that she can act on the world by coordinating hand and eye to grasp an object may grasp the wrong thing. Her father's glasses, her mother's earrings, the knife they failed to see was in her reach. But it's so easy to distract her. All you need to do is put something else in her way. A bunch of keys will usually do it. And the baby is diverted. The objects you don't want her to reach, now completely forgotten. As she grows, distraction gets more difficult, but the principle remains the same. Let's say you've wheeled your 2-year-old through the grocery store, telling her that food can't be eaten before it's paid for, that some things are better or healthier than others, that the packages they're wrapped in often hide more than they reveal, and generally done your best to introduce her to the complex web of social interaction required to provide nourishment in a 21st century city. Finally, you reach the checkout line, where she lights upon brightly gleaming and relatively expensive packs of nutritional garbage, whole rows of them, in fact, placed precisely at eye level of a child in a cart whose capacity for delayed gratification has just been sorely tested. The industrial psychologist who designed that deserves a special place in hell. This is very deliberate. How to distract your child now? Different things will work with different 2-year-olds, and that on different days. Sometimes a firm no and a reminder that you're about to go to the playground. Sometimes a banana and a revision of the lesson that you have to pay for things before you can eat them. On bad days, you may give in and buy the candy or throw a little tantrum yourself. What's important is that distraction is necessary for all but the most authoritarian parents who have no qualms about hitting a child who wants something they're not going to give her. Now, distracting older people from objects of desire is slightly more complicated, but whatever difficulty there may be is easily compensated for by the fact that the things that can be used to distract us are nearly limitless, since the invention of cyberspace, literally limitless. Despite the existence of apps specially designed to make sure your distractions from cyberspace don't reduce your productivity, millions more people took time, this is a couple of years ago, to look at Kim Kardashian's backside than to vote in the elections the week before. Now, it takes less time to Google Kim Kardashian than it does to vote in America, and where turnout has always been a problem that may be of only interest to Europeans who want to understand why American politics are so awful. But Europeans can't be too content. I checked website statistics, and an awful lot of them were watching Kim Kardashian too, when they could have been, for example, reading Thomas Piketty. Now, let me make it quite clear. It happened to be the case that I was reading Thomas Piketty that week, but I was also watching Kim Kardashian with fascinated horror. She said that was the first time the phrase break the internet was used. That was her goal, was to break the internet with that horrible picture. I'm just as capable of being distracted as anyone else is, though I may call that distraction part of a project of understanding the world I live in and adding a little critical cultural commentary, but I would vastly prefer to do without it. I wish I didn't know who Kim Kardashian is. And my daughter tells me that I can't possibly understand how awful things are because I refuse to get on social media. Other things distract me just plenty without that. My computer had been sputtering, as it's programmed to do, shortly after the guarantee runs out, and I finally ordered a replacement. But new features had been added or changed in the name of improvement, and actions I had learned to do without reflection all had to be unlearned. If you added up all the hours spent by all of us on what are cheerfully called upgrades, figuring out the new alarm clock, grill with the new oven, store messages on the new smartphone, save pictures on the new camera, unlock the new auto ignition, I suspect it would be enough to produce enough food to feed the world's hungry children or even a cure for cancer. At the risk of sounding nostalgic, I will mention the only mildly unpleasant thing I know about Immanuel Kant. His house was next to a prison, and he complained bitterly about the hymns sung by prisoners, which distracted him from his work, even writing to the mayor of Königsberg to ask him for help. The letter to the mayor closed with the words, "I do not think they would have cause to complain or that their salvation would be in danger if their voices could be heard when the windows were closed," end quote. And here it's hard not to be wistful. If that's what counted as distraction in late 18th century Königsberg, no wonder they needed authoritarian control. Feudal authoritarian mechanisms for keeping subjects infantilized have given way to more subtle ones, but they're no less powerful and certainly more pervasive for all that. Contemporary mechanisms range from the growing practice of keeping us all under electronic surveillance, or the industry's ability to keep us dazzled by a bewildering number of choices of smartphones or breakfast cereal, while keeping the important choices out of our hands. Totalitarian regimes are seldom necessary and usually counterproductive, for wherever the mechanisms of control are clearly present, some bold souls will be moved to contest them. I was having an argument about this with the German editor of the book that I've just finished, which talks in some ways about one of the things it talks about is East Germany, and he came from East Germany. He wanted to keep arguing that there was a difference between not being able to get books because of censorship and distraction. But everyone who grew up in East Germany tells me how books were prized. I mean, all over Eastern Europe. People handed them, they kept them, they fought over who got to read them first. This is not a problem we have in Western democracies. Simpler and subtler are the infantilizing processes of non-totalitarian societies that encourage our natural laziness by giving us comfort through a range of toys. Of course, neither smartphones nor automobiles are described as toys. It's very important they're portrayed as the tools without which no adult life is complete. By contrast, ideas of a more just and humane world are portrayed as childish dreams to be discarded in favor of the real business of acquiring toys. That is, finding a steady job that fixes our place in the consumer economy. It's a crazy reversal that leaves us permanently confused. Now, that confusion in its infancy gave rise to Peter Pan and accounts for his popularity to this day. Just 2 years ago, major theaters in New York, London, and Berlin all produced new and different versions of the play, confirming my suspicion that the appeal of the boy who won't grow up is still very much with us and capable of new transformations. And if you look at the transformations, they document the changes over the 20th century in our picture of growing up. It's a sad, bad business from the start, but in the original novel, it's just boring. In 1911, J.M. Barrie described Mr. Darling's knowledge as confined to stocks and shares, and his only passion was being just like his neighbors. In the mid-century film version that I was raised on, Mr. Darling was still the consummate grown-up, that is, still deadly dull and possibly a little silly, but also possibly deadly. His authority was slightly menacing, and the booming voice can so easily turn threatening that the same actor could play both Mr. Darling and Captain Hook. Now, let's suppose that this double casting was not just about reducing production costs, but showing that Peter Pan has to fight both. By the end of the 20th century, however, the grown-up has become ridiculous. My children grew up with the brilliantly disturbing twist on the story in Steven Spielberg's Hook, which the younger ones among you probably know. It's a film that I intensely disliked when I took my children to see it, but I only understood why when I started thinking about this book. In it, the adult, now an overworked lawyer named Peter Panning, is still wretched and boring, but he's no longer an object of fear, but of contempt. By the end of the 20th century, the adult is so pitiful that the camera leads us to join in the youngster's mockery of him. Any parent who doesn't recognize herself in that speech is probably a saint. For the rest of us, Spielberg's evocation of the downsides of parenting remind us that the ending is not all that happy. We've been reminded of the softest side of adulthood, the love for one's own children that really is like nothing else, and made to remember even that is hard. It may have much more value than ringing phones and mortgage payments and the sort of things that lawyers are meant to do, but it too has disappointment. So here's the trope: growing up as giving up, growing up as giving in. That's the message of Peter Pan, and his status as a symbol has held steady for 100 years, not just for cases like Michael Jackson, but for some of the people I most cherished, those who I mentioned in the beginning as very successful grown-ups. For those who view him as a hero, Peter Pan is a symbol of rebellion against a system that seeks to bend us into shapes that fit a penny-pinching society so burdened it no longer knows how to live. When we're surrounded by voices that urge us to play the parts that have already been written for us, Peter Pan seems to be a rejection of resignation. But what if we've got it exactly backwards, which is my argument? What if we live in a culture that doesn't really want grown-ups because self-obsessed infantile citizens are easier to manage? This was Kant's claim in What is Enlightenment, however often it's been ignored. And if that's true, what better way to keep people in self-imposed immaturity than to present such a dismal picture of adulthood that no one with soul and spirit could possibly aspire to it? Then it isn't Peter Pan's rebellion that's genuinely subversive, but on the contrary, the decision to embrace growing up with all the freedom it implies. Of course, I'm not suggesting that J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, was in the pay of evil forces who plotted to make adulthood look so unappealing. From what we know about Barrie, he was convinced of the vision himself, as are most of the people whose interest this vision serves. So what I'm arguing is that being grown up means being able to face the split between the way the world is and the way the world ought to be, that Nietzsche called the metaphysical wound in the heart of the universe, without ever giving up the claims that each of those two ways of seeing the world makes on us. This stance is so difficult that it's a permanent struggle for balance. And as such, it's just the opposite of the resignation or the stillness for which attitude is known. So immaturity is not just practically, but metaphysically easier to sustain. If immaturity is harder to resist than sustain, it's worth pointing out that though many oppressive features of the social world arise without design, one crucial idea, planned obsolescence, was actually the work of a conspiracy. Until the early 20th century, people who made objects or owned factories in which other people made objects proceeded on the assumption that good things were made to last. Hannah Arendt described the desire to create something of value, something that would last longer than we do, was crucial to human being itself. There's Michael Jackson. Where are we? Light bulbs. At a 1924 meeting in Switzerland, a cartel of manufacturers agreed to reduce the life of light bulbs, which at the time proudly averaged 2,500 hours, to 1,000 hours, which did more than double the number of light bulbs sold. It's the first recorded instance of manufacturers deliberately planning to diminish the quality of their products. But perhaps the cartel and the fines that it levied on members who didn't want to degrade their light bulbs was unnecessary, for the idea was in the air. The auto industry discovered it early, which allowed General Motors to dominate the market by 1931, edging out Henry Ford, who clung to the old-fashioned idea that things should be built to last. I'm going to skip a little so that we have some more time for discussion. The phrase planned obsolescence went out of use after it was criticized by a number of sociologists, which is probably the reason, and it was replaced by the woollier term product life cycle. Life cycles sound normal, part of a natural organic process of birth and decay. We now find it natural that most of the objects we use will need to be replaced before or just after we've finished paying for them. And of course, we now know what kind of damage this is doing to the planet. We no longer pause to consider what this unnatural form of production does to us, those whose workday consists of making or selling things designed to deconstruct, as well as those whose leisure consists of buying them. As producers and consumers, we're preoccupied with toys, while the truly adult questions, like who runs the world and what can we do to change it, are dismissed as naive. In a rare private disclosure, Steve Jobs said the question of which dishwasher to buy consumed discussion at his family dinner table for weeks, and he offered this as an example of democratic deliberation. But I'd be surprised if similar attention was devoted, say, the question of labor conditions at Apple factories in China. Why are $1.7 trillion available every year for military spending, but funds for food, education, and medicine fall short? If you ask a question like this, you're likely to be treated like the child in the emperor's new clothes. Everyone knows it, and no one wants to acknowledge it, and people who insist on raising it should be ashamed for pointing out the obvious. It took another child, Malala Yousafzai, to point it out. When she risked her life to insist that girls should be educated as boys are, the world paid attention and made her the youngest person to ever receive the Nobel Peace Prize. When she used her education to point out that we could educate every child on the planet for 12 years on, get this, a mere 8 days of the money spent every year by the arms industry. The speech got very little attention. It's a speech that unsettles everyone, for we don't even know how to begin to react to it or change the world so as to redistribute our priorities. I've been mulling around this fact, and I checked it with a Nobel laureate and economist. He said, yeah, the numbers are right, okay? So here we have a fact. 8 days of military spending would educate every child in the world for 12 years. A real adult should put herself to work figuring out how to do something with that fact. Again, I'm going to skip because this has gone on longer than I meant to. I'll leave you with a picture of Malala. I've been asked if the fear of growing up is just the fear of growing old, and that fear, nothing but the fear of death. My sense is actually that people in their 20s think more about death than those in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. The closer we get to it, the less inclined we are to waste the time we have left reflecting on death as an existential problem. We look with bemusement on Dorian Gray and Oscar Wilde's novel. I quote Oscar Wilde, "Yes, there would be a day when his face would be wrinkled, his eyes dim and colorless, the grace of his figure broken and deformed, the scarlet would pass from his lips, the gold steal from his hair. The life that was to make his soul would mar his body." And for Dorian Gray, of course, that was the worst thought in the world, Dorian Gray being an extremely narcissistic, body-obsessed kind of young man, of whom, unfortunately, there are many, and women, of course, in this day and age. But it's an incredible sentence, because grown-ups prefer the life that makes our souls to the unmarred bodies of our youth. In the end, I believe that the fear of growing up is less a fear of dying than a fear of life itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, maybe we should continue. So, the fear
this
of
was a
growing up.
small part of a book. This was taken from various bits of a book that I wrote.
Yes, and it's a very rich book, and we'll discuss it some more, and we'll also discuss two other young, girls it seems a bit demeaning, or young female. Yeah, one of 12, one of now 16.
I think 16 is still a girl.
Yeah, still a girl? Still a girl. But first of all, so...
I mean, I don't think girl is an insult any more than old is an insult. So it's just a fact.
It's a fact, yeah. But why... So growing up is about a fear of life. That's how you ended up. Could you get into that a bit more? Why is it a fear of life? Is it a fear of taking responsibility for your life, or what?
I mean, that's the sort of thing that people say, but then, of course, they go on to make taking responsibility sound so bloody awful, right? I think that real grown-ups, and this is something I didn't go into at too much length, but I talk about in the book, I think the most important difference in the world, and one that runs through all of our lives, is the difference between the ought and the is. The difference between the way the world should be and the way we find it. And it is much easier to go for one and not keep your eyes on both, right? It's much easier either to spin out some fantasy about the way the world ought to be and convince yourself, and this is something that fanatics and ideologues of various kinds do, or a small child doesn't yet see the difference between the ought and the is and just assumes the saddest cases of this, of course, are cases of abused children who take many, many years to realize that there was something wrong with the abuse because they had no other experience against which they could measure it. So one easy way out is just to say the way the world is all there is, and it is the way the world ought to be. The other way to go, which is the way that cynics go, and many adolescents, is to say, the way the world is all there is. Any claims about the way the world ought to be is a fantasy, a utopia, a pipe dream, and I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to be realistic, okay? Yeah. And growing up is supposedly a matter of becoming realistic, which is then translated into be resigned to the way the world is. And I argue, sort of riffing on Kant, that actually growing up is keeping those two things in mind and trying never to lose sight of both of them.
So these are two separate duties. So Kant says we have a duty to try and figure out how the world really is, and then we have another duty that's equally important. That's to figure out how we think the world ought to be.
Correct. And to try to narrow the gap, okay? Yeah. They will never entirely coincide. I mean, if they did, it would be heaven or the best of all possible worlds. Yeah. But to try to narrow that gap, that's our task as adults. That's hard, because it's very, very hard to keep both of those things in mind at the same time.
But has this task gotten even harder nowadays? In an interview in the Volkskrant this weekend, you mentioned that it's hard to be an idealist in an age of depressive prospects and a bleak future. Is that?
Look, so I did give an interview last week, and I don't read Dutch, so I'm not sure how much of the interview got taken. Look, the reason I went through the discussion of traditional societies and then moved to the Enlightenment is that I think it's been hard since the Enlightenment, since our lives have a certain amount of choice to them, okay? Since we don't simply take over the lives that our parents took. Is this a particularly hard time to be alive? Yeah, I would say so. It's extremely hard for a number of reasons. I don't know how long you want me to go on about this, particularly because I think that the bad news is in front of all of us. Anybody who's moderately aware of what's going on in the world knows that on the one hand, I'm a hopeful person. I don't call myself an optimist. An optimist would be making claims about the way the world is, and the way the world is right now is pretty awful. So, but I'm hopeful because I feel like, I believe we have an obligation to be hopeful, because otherwise we won't do anything. So,
and an optimist would be wrong because they think they know everything's going to be all right.
That's
they
right.
don't have to act anyway.
That's right.
It happens anyway.
That's right. And we don't know that everything's going to be all right.
Yeah. So we need to hope.
My hope is that climate change, which is the most immediate thing threatening all of us, that climate change will become at, a minute and a half before midnight, the question on which people will unite, in which we'll have international cooperation, and in particular in which neoliberal capitalism, which I hold to be the source of many, many of the evils that we're facing right now, will realize that it will be our ruin, literally.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's, but those are very difficult. The prospects of that hope being realized are small, and I realize that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe this is time now to go. I was looking for one quote from Greta Thunberg. I already mentioned her in my opening. So the 16-year-old climate activist from Sweden who started her school strike I think in September. So every Fridays for future. So on Friday she's striking near the Swedish Parliament, and she's been quite inspiring. And now I think 2 weeks back we had Dutch students or high school students.
All over Germany as well.
All over Germany as
Britain also.
Yeah. And so she said, addressing the adults in the room in Katowice, "You are not mature enough to tell it like it is. Even that burden you leave to us children. So you only talk about moving forward with the same bad ideas that got us into this mess, even when the only sensible thing to do is to pull the emergency brake." So she tells us you need to panic. And then she says, "You're not mature enough to tell it like it is, so this is like it is. Even that burden you leave to us children." Is this a grown-up talking? Or is this... It struck me. I really liked it that she claimed that the parents in the room were childish in a way, not taking full responsibility.
So this is why I put Malala at the end of my talk, and this goes back to the whole to Hans Christian Andersen's story of the Emperor's New Clothes, which I assume everybody knows. That actually everyone can see that the emperor is naked. And has been completely bamboozled. But everyone except the child is embarrassed to point it out. Now, this is not real adulthood, although the people are biologically speaking adults, the people who say, yes, it's beautiful. This is adolescence. These are adolescents whose worst fear is being, called uncool by their peers. Yeah. And an awful lot of what goes wrong in Western democracies, I've become increasingly convinced, has to do with embarrassment. It's really quite ridiculous because it's the last thing that we ought to be embarrassed of embarrassment. But talking about climate change, talking about military spending, as Malala is doing, is seen as something that's naive. And, people sort of sit back and... So she's naive because it's like a force of nature. There's nothing you can do about it. The spending on weapons is something that needs to be done. So climate change will inevitably get worse, period. Well, it'll get worse. Oh, the technocrats will fix it. Okay. Somehow we'll be able to figure it out. I think it's wonderful what she and my 15-year-old niece is involved in that movement in Germany. I think it's absolutely wonderful. And of course, precisely because of the structure that Andersen pointed out in that story, young people have often been at the forefront of revolutions. So that is my hope that this will take place, and those of us who are biologically adult will be able to talk about and actually face the questions that the children are rightly asking, and figure out the mechanisms by which they can be changed.
Yeah. So you mentioned embarrassment as an emotion that plays a big role, but. Isn't maybe guilt or shame an even more important one than when you try to do the right thing? So one could say that Greta Thunberg is trying to do the right thing, leading by example, etc. People really, really like to shame her in a way, or point to hypocrisy, or to shame her in a way, saying she's a good mensch or whatever, or it's said of other. So what is going on here, why do we, there's a lot of hateful reactions to what she's doing. She's pointed it out also a few weeks back in an interesting Facebook post. So why are we acting, or are a lot of people acting so emotionally to a girl of 16 like Greta Thunberg, who's trying to do the right thing?
Well, I honestly don't understand it, and I also don't understand the horrible word Gutmensch, which you also have in German.
Yeah.
I mean, but it seems to me simply an expression of, again, this attitude, which is an attitude of shame. So when you distinguish between guilt and shame, guilt is generally something that's internal, and shame is external. Shame is what you feel about what other people think of you, right? And guilt is something that you feel about yourself. My guess is that we probably feel both, okay? That at some level, we realize that she's telling the truth.
Yeah.
And feel guilty that we're not doing more about it. And there's a certain amount of shame as well, but the shame then gets projected onto her. I mean, it's, kill the messenger, right? This is a...
But what would being a grown-up mean? Being able to mitigate, to work with the guilt and the shame, to acknowledge it? And
Yes, it would be able to... First of all, I mean, shame is... Sometimes shame can be productive. Usually it's not. But guilt can be... guilt is usually talked about as unproductive. If it simply stays as guilt, of course, it is unproductive. If you feel guilty about something that you've done or haven't done, and then take steps to change that, then it's a very productive emotion. Yeah. I mean, look, adults can learn from children. I learn all the time. It's interesting. The Me Too movement sent me apologizing to my daughters, 2 daughters in their mid-20s, who had complained of sexual harassment as early as late high school.
Yeah.
And I had basically told them, honey, it sucks, but that's just the way the world is, which was really interesting because I'm not a person who usually says, oh, that's the way the world is. I mean, this is my mantra, actually. Yeah. But I had said that about sexual harassment and certain kinds of comments, and it really took Me Too for me to run through all of these experiences that I have had. And I mean, for a while, this is now over a year ago, every woman I know was suddenly talking about stories that had happened to them, basically from, late adolescence on. And to realize, so actually that could be changed. It doesn't have to be the way the world is. So, I'm hoping in the same way that I was able to acknowledge that I had simply swallowed something that my daughters were not prepared to swallow, that people will do the same with Greta what's her name? Thunberg, but all the thousands of other children who are doing the same thing in other countries.
Yeah. But must this be a youth thing, or do you feel like you yourself must be? It's very important that you keep on being idealistic, and I don't know. Are you? Is there something the youth just doesn't get that you do get because you're mature and you can teach them?
Oh, there are plenty of things that I get.
Yeah. Because now it seems like we're I don't know, believing that the youth they will fix it, So there's
no, I think that's
where all the energy needs to come from.
No. I actually met an African woman the other day who told me, well, I'm 60 now. I don't feel responsible for the world anymore. I can let the youth take over. Again, it was interesting because she actually runs a refugee center. And it didn't look like she was stopping working there either. So, that should be taken with a grain of salt. No, there's an Israeli folk song that used to bother me tremendously. And it goes roughly, take care of the world, child, because we didn't manage to do so.
Yeah.
And that seems absolutely horrible.
That's very
that just
cynical.
yeah, you know, and I think particularly if one puts children into the world, but even if one doesn't, that one has a responsibility to go down fighting. And of course, there are things. I mean, I learn things from my children; they still learn things from me. I don't think that any particular, perhaps particular ages tend to be sources of different kinds of wisdom or different kinds of understanding. But I think it would be absolutely crazy to privilege one at the expense of all the others.
Yeah. But there's a responsibility to be some sort of grown-up in all stages.
There's a responsibility to aspire towards growing up. One thing that I didn't realize when I wrote this book, which I kind of wrote in a hurry, and then I did a number of talks about it, and I realized, of course, all the things that I hadn't put in. So I actually wrote a second edition. I don't know if you have the first or the second edition.
I'm not.
I think you have the second.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
2015?
Yeah, no, maybe not. It was 16. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But I think the word grown-up suggests that it's a process that has an ending. And I actually don't think it does. I think it's a process that continues unless one puts an unnatural stop to it one's whole life long. It's an aspiration. It's not a state that you get to.
No.